Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 2, Fledgling, Chapters 7 and 8. Let's begin. Little Lord, Gigantomachia greeted Izuku happily when the boy appeared through Kurogiri's warp gate. The misty man reformed behind his passenger and gave all for one a look. When he delivered Izuku and picked him up, it wasn't unusual for his boss to have new instructions. The Emperor of the Underworld shook his head slightly and Kurogiri bowed before disappearing. My little dragon, is something wrong? All for one asked. Usually, when Izuku was delivered he happily skipped over to Gigantomachia to tell the giant about his day. Today Izuku had remained where he was standing. Nothing's wrong, Daddy, Izuku said to him, but he was still looking at Gigantomachia. Did you want to ask my bodyguard something? All for one asked his son. Izuku thought about that for a few moments, before he nodded. While All for one couldn't see, he could imagine the look on Gigantomachia's face. He would be surprised but pleased. What does the little lord want to know? The huge man rumbled gently. Will you teach me to fight? It was safe to say that neither of them were expecting the question. Izuku? All for one said the name as a question. Little lord, you are not like Tomura, so you are wert. No, Izuku interrupted Gigantomachia. I'm not, but I want to be. So you want Gigantomachia to train you? All for one asked. Yes, I want him to teach me to fight, Izuku repeated his request. The huge man shifted slightly. Kurogiri as he began but stopped when All for one raised one hand. Kurogiri is teaching Izuku to use his quirks, the Emperor of the Underworld explained. The large man understood the unspoken part of the information. It was Gigantomachia's decision if he wished to teach Izuku or not, but All for one knew what the answer would be. There was no way Gigantomachia would deny Izuku. He saw the huge man nod before he shifted again, looking down at Izuku who was still standing, looking up at him. All for one heard Gigantomachia take several deep breaths. Little lord, I will teach you, he said eventually, but only if you use your full power. For a moment, All for one didn't understand what his bodyguard meant, but then it became clear. He didn't smile, but it was a close thing. Gigantomachia's condition would force Izuku to accept the reality of combat, and that would only help him grow stronger. What do you mean? Izuku asked. He hadn't grasped the implications of the large man's condition. Gigantomachia shifted, kneeling so that he was slightly closer to Izuku. He still towered above his son, but the gesture was not unappreciated. You must use your quirk. When you fight me, even in practice, you must take a quirk. But Izuku objected, but All for one could tell he wasn't quite sure what he was objecting to. When you are in battle, little lord, you cannot hesitate. You can take their quirk, so you should do it. This is your greatest advantage and you should use it. Izuku said nothing. All for one could tell that he was thinking. If the quirk is not useful, Izuku, you can give it back, All for one reminded his son. Or if it is useful, you can keep it since you won it in the battle. But I won't have earned it, Izuku said. In some fights you will, Izuku. Don't limit yourself by society's expectations, All for one explained. A battle is not about honor, little lord. It is about victory, and you must do what you can to gain victory by any means possible. You have the means, so you need to use it, Gigantomachia added. Izuku nodded, but it was easy to tell he was still thinking. All for one decided another small push would be needed. It was essential that Izuku be able to take quirks even from those who didn't want him to. They had been gentle so far, but if introducing the concept as part of a battle strategy would help, then he would back that. Izuku, I want you to remember something you've seen. What? The question sounded harsh, but Izuku was curious. History is written by the victors, All for one told his son. Izuku frowned. It was difficult to see, but that was the impression Hisashi got. How? All Might, All for one said, and Toxic Chainsaw. It was perhaps a risk to refer to that battle, but Izuku was moved by it. You know that All Might did not fight Toxic Chainsaw, but that is what the world believes, he explained. And there is one more thing they are covering up, he added with a small chuckle. What is that? I know what damage I did to him. My little dragon. All Might is not as healthy as he appears, he said somewhat proudly. He'd have preferred to have done more, and not received any damage himself, but lingering on that might have been was not productive. He saw Gigantomachia nodding at his statements. That is why, little lord, you must always fight to win, and use all the means you have to fight, the large man explained. I understand, Izuku said, and he seemed to. But I can't take a quirk off you, Gigantomachia. You're my friend. That harkened back to something Izuku had said many years back. I think when training with Gigantomachia, you can pretend to take one of his quirks, All For One announced, looking over at his bodyguard. If he actually took one, it could destabilize you, my old friend, he explained. However, for your practice sessions, I will give Izuku a random quirk to simulate what he could find himself with. Gigantomachia nodded. If you are willing to take quirks, little lord, I will teach you, he said. Izuku took a deep breath. I am willing, he confirmed. The huge man smiled. To anyone else, it probably looked threatening. Izuku knew it meant Gigantomachia was pleased. All For One nodded. No matter what else happened today during Izuku's visit, this was good. His son would grow and learn to use his quirk. And isn't that what any parent wanted for their child? Izuku smiled at him. It was nice to see, and Hisashi realized that his son must have been nervous about asking. He also wondered why Izuku was asking. What brought this on, my little dragon? He asked. Immediately Izuku looked to the ground. While All For One couldn't see, he shared a glance with Gigantomachia. His bodyguard was still kneeling and Izuku had walked up to him now. Gigantomachia scooped him up, putting him on his shoulder. I got into a fight, Izuku said quietly. All For One immediately ran through his memory. While he relegated the day-to-day care of Izuku to Kurogiri, and had the Misty Man deal with the school, he was made aware of important events and details. There had been no mention of this, and it was the type of thing Kurogiri would mention. The school has not mentioned anything, he said mildly. He may have to have another word with them. It was after school, Izuku admitted. But still on the school grounds? Yes, my little dragon, I'm not upset with you, Hisashi was quick to reassure his son. I am upset with your school. They are meant to prevent things like that, and in the event that they happen, they are meant to let me know. How did it happen? Even if Izuku got into a fight, there was no way he should have lost. He had regeneration and increased strength, and All For One sighed inwardly. He wouldn't have used them. He wouldn't have wanted to get caught having multiple quirks. It was admirable and showed loyalty, but they would have to work some way around it. Teaching Izuku to fight would be one way. If he didn't rely on his quirks, or only subtly relied on his quirks, then that would go a long way to addressing the problem. It would be much easier when Izuku could openly fight, but subterfuge and subtlety were useful skills. Ochako and Hitoshi weren't at school today, Izuku said. Is everything all right? Hisashi asked. He didn't care, but the question was expected. Ochako had family things and Hitoshi has a bit of a sniffle, his little dragon told him. I was eating lunch when Gatarui came up. Betsu told me he has been wanting to fight me for a while. All For One translated the statement. This Gatarui was obviously the one Izuku had fought, but he didn't know who Betsu was. Izuku seldom mentioned anyone from his class. So what happened? He prompted. I wanted to say no, Izuku said. But they'd been bullying Ochako while I wasn't there and I got so angry. Hisashi nodded. Izuku's loyalty to his friends was to be commended. At least for now. Hitoshi wouldn't betray Izuku, but Ochako might yet hurt him. For now, the girl child had done nothing, so he had done nothing. And with him helping her parents, it was possible she wouldn't do anything. She didn't have to become a villain to help out Izuku in future. He would need friends. Then I remembered that if I fought and got a cut, regeneration would take effect and they'd know. So why didn't you just not go to the fight? All For One asked. He couldn't keep the amused tone from his voice. They hurt Ochako. Izuku repeated, and while All For One couldn't see clearly, he could see the way that the outline that was his son trembled. And I couldn't use my quirk. It's all right, my little dragon. I know you were protecting me, he reassured his son. Izuku would have wanted to hide his multiple quirks because he knew that would go down on a record and it was possible that the heroes would find out. As far as he knew, they still believed him to be dead, but it was better safe than sorry. Although, my little dragon, there is a way of winning a battle without fighting, All For One said. What? How? Izuku demanded. I know you wouldn't have taken his quirk for the same reason you didn't want to have regeneration revealed, Hisashi said. But, I have noticed there is a difference between our quirks. Do you know what it is? You need to touch someone to take their quirk? Izuku asked. All For One smiled at his son even as he shook his head. Not that difference. I don't know then, Izuku said without thinking about it, but Hisashi could tell that he was trying to work out what any difference between their quirks had to do with fighting. When I take a quirk from someone, my little dragon, unless I am careful, they fall unconscious. All For One explained. But Kurogiri and Giran tell me that when you took the lady's quirk she remained conscious. Is that deliberate? At that question, Izuku took on an air of consideration. He was obviously thinking hard. I don't know, he said. Then I think we shall have to find out, All for One said. But do you see how it could end a fight? Yes. If I could take his quirk, and knock him out, then Gatorui would have just collapsed. I could have given him his quirk back and no one would have known what was happening. Izuku gushed. He already sounded a lot more confident about the thought of taking quirks. All for One nodded. That's it exactly, my little dragon, he praised. He'd have to work on the give it back bit, but for the moment, Izuku was correct. Giving it back would raise less questions, especially at his school. Actually, Daddy, Izuku looked at him. What happens when we take a mutant quirk? Now that was an interesting question and it revealed more than his son knew. This Gatorui must have a mutant-type quirk. It varies, my little dragon, All for One replied confidently. He had experimented with this many years ago. Can you tell me the 3 types of quirks? Izuku immediately nodded. Emitter, Transformer and Mutant. Very good. Now, within each type there is a lot of variety. There are those people who look to have mutant quirks, but actually have emitter quirks, Hisashi explained. Can you think of some examples? He thought his son blinked a few times before he nodded. Kurogiri, he said. Tell me how? Kurogiri looks to have a mutant-type quirk but actually has an emitter quirk. Exactly, All for One replied. So, that's why I say it varies. You don't always know what type of quirk they have. Mutant-type quirks are not impossible to take. You have taken one once you know. I have? Hisashi smiled. Regeneration, he told Izuku. That is a mutant-type quirk, and I actually have a copy of Dr. Garaki's quirk, and it is a mutant-type quirk. It is? He nodded. But those quirks are what I call hidden mutant-type quirks or emitter mutant types. They are mutant-type, but they leave no evidence on the owner's body, like a lot of emitter-type quirks. Other mutant quirks are more obvious. When you take one of those, the effect varies. It depends on how much of the quirk relied on the visible mutation, All for One explained. So, for someone with a tail, they'd still have the tail, but what would I get if I took their quirk? Hisashi could hear the frown in Izuku's voice. The person has a mutant-type quirk that gives them a tail? He clarified. Yes. I don't see why you'd want that quirk, but you would get the ability to manipulate a tail, he said. But would I get a tail? No, All for One said instantly. If the quirk is only mutant, and does not have any transformation aspect, then you would simply get the ability to manipulate a tail you don't have. Oh, Izuku said, and All for One could tell he was thinking about Gatorui. What is Gataru's mutation? He asked. Spider, came Izuku's reply. If you took his quirk and kept it, he might then suffer physical complications, All for One said. What do you mean? Someone with a tail would suffer minimal complications from the loss of their quirk, because their body would be able to handle having the tail, especially if it is a tail that comes from another mammal. But a spider-type quirk is mixing arachnid characteristics with a mammal. There could be medical complications if you kept his quirk. Then I can't take it. Izuku cried. It would take a while. My little dragon. You could take his quirk to end the fight and give it back and there would be no harm, he reassured his son. We can take mutant-type quirks, but sometimes they aren't worth it, except for the other effects, he explained. Izuku nodded, apparently comforted by the knowledge that he wouldn't do permanent damage immediately. So, if you get into a fight with him again? All for One prompted. Izuku shook his head. First I have to learn to take quirks like you. Then, if we get into a fight, he didn't finish. All for One chuckled. Gigantomachia echoed his sentiment. His son was so precious. Exactly, Hisashi praised. Izuku smiled down at him from Gigantomachia's shoulder. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was blinding and that his son was happy, and for a moment, all was right with the world. Sorry, Izu, why was the red blood cell banned from church? The text from Himiko made him smile. She might not have had her phone yesterday, but she had answered now. Because he said God's name in vain. Izuku sent back with a grin. Himiko messaged him. I might not be able to answer quickly for the next bit, she added in a new message. Is everything okay? Izuku had typed the reply before he even thought about it. There was a bit of a break before she replied. You know I like blood, Izu? Of course you do, it's for your quirk. My parents are worrying, Himiko sent to him. Because you like blood? Yes. That didn't make any sense. Transform didn't work without blood, so that's why Himiko had to have it. And her quirk made her like it. Which was good, because it was kinda gross otherwise. There wasn't anything wrong with her. There's nothing wrong with you, Izuku replied, repeating his thoughts for her to see. Happy emoticon. Izuku sighed. We'll talk when you can then? He sent the question. Of course, Izu. He really hoped Himiko would be okay, but he knew there wasn't anything he could do except support her in text. Izuku resolved to look up some more blood jokes. It was the least he could do. Eating his lunch today was different. Ochako and Hitoshi were both back at school. They'd met today in Ochako's classroom, since it was pouring outside. The nice weather of yesterday had given way to rain today. He'd gotten a few odd looks this morning from a variety of people. There hadn't been too many people present yesterday, but word had spread. He huffed. He could tell from the way Ochako and Hitoshi were looking at him that they'd heard as well. Why don't you just ask? Izuku prompted them. Ochako and Hitoshi shared a look. What happened? Ochako finally asked. Her brown eyes were wide with worry. The classroom wasn't full, but Izuku could feel the way the other kids were listening in. Gatarui was being a dick, he said bluntly. Ochako's eyes widened. I only swear when I mean it, Izuku said mildly before she could ask. Hitoshi chuckled. So he was being a dick, and you beat him up? The purple-haired boy asked. I did not. Izuku defended himself. He challenged me, he added, giving Ochako a pointed look. She looked at him quizzically, trying to interpret it. All right, Hitoshi allowed. You beat each other up, except you look pretty good. Izuku had thought about what he wanted to say about not having bruises. Gatarui didn't have any, but that's because Kaiten didn't show them. He didn't like lying to his friends, but protecting his dad was more important. He shrugged. Tomura hits harder, he announced. Tomura is 14, Hitoshi pointed out. Yeah? Izuku asked, confused. The teen was older, but what did that have to do with anything? Hitoshi blew a breath out. You're impossible, he growled, but Izuku could tell it was half in jest. Ochako, Izuku said, looking back to his other friend. She still looked worried for him, and he thought he could see tears forming in the corner of her eyes. I promise you, he didn't hurt me, Izuku reassured her. But he wanted to, she said, reaching up to wipe the tear before it fell. Izuku looked at her. He had white hair today and knew he looked a little bit like his dad. It kind of made him happy to be that way. Well, I wanted to hurt him, he admitted. What? Why? Ochako was shocked by his admission. Even Hitoshi looked surprised. Because he hurt you, he answered her question. He hasn't, she objected. Izuku just kept looking at her. He hasn't, Ochako repeated. He recognized the irony of his words even as he said them. His friends didn't know he was lying to them. Don't lie to me. He made sure the statement was soft, not challenging. Ochako sighed heavily. She looked to the side. It told Izuku he was right. It wasn't much, she admitted. When you moved to Niigata, it was mostly a Jimmy, she told them. Who's a Jimmy? Hitoshi asked. A dick, Izuku said. He was in the year above us, but Gatarui and Arata followed him around. Hitoshi nodded. He didn't know exactly who this Jimmy was, but he knew his type. They shouldn't have done anything. The teachers should have stopped them. It wasn't that bad, Ochako defended. Izuku gave her a look. It told her he didn't care if it wasn't that bad. It shouldn't have happened. She huffed. Little dragon, they shouldn't call you a sympathizer, but they do. People do lots of stupid things, she added. Izuku sighed. If they do anything again, Izuku paused, not quite sure what he'd do. If he beat up Gatarui, then he'd get punished, and that wasn't good. Hitoshi chuckled. You'll do what? He sounded interested. I don't know, Izuku had to admit. Hitoshi winked at Ochako when she giggled at Izuku's dilemma. How about if they do anything? I make 'em turn themselves into a teacher? Hitoshi offered the alternative. But then you'll get in trouble. Ochako objected, though she sounded pleased that they would stand up for her. Not that much, Hitoshi shrugged. After all, I might have used my quirk, but I didn't force him to lie, he explained. Izuku shook his head. I doubt it would work that way, he said realistically. In fact, he was sure it wouldn't work that way. He was positive that the teachers would overlook whatever Gatarui or Arata admitted to because they wouldn't see past the fact that Hitoshi had used his quirk to make him confess. Ochako gave them both a wan smile. How about we ignore them? Besides, we know they are too cowardly to do anything if we are together, she added. That was true. I don't like it. Izuku nodded his agreement even as he said the words. Actually ignoring them would probably be best, Hitoshi agreed with Ochako. Acknowledging them only validates their opinions and we all know their opinions suck, he said. Izuku laughed at that. Hitoshi had obviously been reading some online forums to have an opinion like that. He wondered who he was quoting. It was true though. All right, we'll ignore them, he agreed. Just so long as they ignore us, he added the condition. Ochako and Hitoshi shared another glance before they nodded. Izuku gave them a smile. He might say that, but he fully expected Gatorui to challenge him again another day. He'd be ready. Are you sure this game can be won this way? Izuku asked Tomura. He'd just managed to live a grand total of 4 seconds after Tomura's character had been killed. It is, if you don't die, the teen snarled. At least the snarl was directed towards the screen. Izuku said nothing at that. He hadn't died. Or rather, he had, but that was because Tomura's character had died. He was playing support for Tomura and you couldn't really expect the support character to survive past the main character. If you are sure, how about we both play attack characters then? Izuku suggested. Tomura actually paused from loading the last game save. Thankfully they hadn't gotten too far into this game, so restarting with him as another attack character wouldn't take too long. Izuku thought about the character lineup. How about I change to Waka? He remembered Tomura had rejected that choice earlier because the character was too nice and traditionally Waka was played on the hero side. The teen thought about it for a few moments. He was reluctant to change but they simply hadn't progressed as far as he needed to and perhaps having a double attack would be okay. They could always just max out potion buying instead of having a support character. Alright, he agreed. At least we'll get through the start more easily, Izuku said, waiting for Tomura to take him back to the menu. As player 1 Tomura had most of the control that way. PFT. I think we are close enough still that you can change character, he said, trying to remember what he'd seen online. Really? Izuku didn't have to feign excitement at that news. The beginning of this game had too many cutscenes that slowed it down. Yeah, Tomura confirmed his words as he took him back to the menu and clicked through to settings. See, you can do it here, he told Izuku, already scrolling through Izuku's character settings. Hang on, that's going to reset me back to starting levels. Izuku objected. Deal with it, Tomura rolled his eyes even as he clicked through the warning. Izuku groaned but knew better than to say anything else. Instead, he flicked through his inventory. There were some power-ups there he could use, and he quickly applied them to his new character. If they went back to the beginning yet again, they'd just have to go back and farm them again. He checked the weapons next and selected a new one. It was better suited for attacking. While he was doing that, Tomura was loading up on potions and mana restores. Do we have to talk to anyone again now that I've changed characters? Izuku asked. Nah, Tomura shook his head as he directed his character towards the outskirts of the town they were in. Let's go, he commanded. Izuku gave one last check over his in-game gear before he nodded and followed. Hopefully they do better this round. First, medical tech is really sweet. I should have looked at it earlier. Izuku looked at his phone as it buzzed. The messages were from May. But I can make it better. The follow-up message made him smile. She was that type of person. How is it good? Izuku asked, referring to her opening statement. All the pumps are so efficient. And the redundancy. He didn't really understand what she was talking about but knew enough to know that he should be impressed. How can you make it better? I can make it smaller. And I can definitely give him better battery life. The smallest ones go on your back. A picture accompanied the text. Then you've got all the cables. They get in the way. Izuku looked at the image. The filtration tube ran from the unit to the back of the head into a helmet-like device with a clear faceplate. He could see how it would get in the way. I can do better. Could you build it into a helmet, so that there is no tubing? Izuku sent the question. Yep, you're thinking the same as me. He smiled. But, it's going to take time. As I said, med tech is good. Izuku nodded. He hadn't really expected anything immediately. How long? He sent back. There was a pause in the message stream. He thought May was thinking about it. As the time went on, Izuku hoped she wasn't rethinking her words. A while, came the reply. It would be faster if I had one to work with, but they're expensive. How expensive? He had to ask. At least 100,000 yen. I've been looking online at plans and designs but without actually having one. I can't really see how they work. That was expensive, but then Izuku reminded himself it was for a very technical piece of equipment. His school computer had cost that much, and he knew the consoles Tomura had cost a lot. Could you get an old one? I hadn't thought of that. Let me check. The response was almost immediate. The silence this time was much more reassuring. Izuku thought about what he wanted. A smaller, more powerful respirator for his dad was a start. Even if it wasn't technically making money, he knew his dad would agree it was a good investment. Can you make it more powerful? Izuku added the question in the silence. Yes. While the response was positive, it was definitely distracted. He put down his phone and went back to his homework. The sooner he could get it done, the sooner he could go watch TV and write in his notebook. I can get one for about 30,000 yen. It's X stock, so not in spec. Izuku wasn't sure what that meant. You are positive you can improve it? I'm sure. First, he bit his lip. It was a lot, but it was not all the money Dad had given him. If you had one, how long would it take? I think about 6 months. That seemed to be a long time, especially if she would then have a prototype. Medtech is good, and if I'm making it better, I have to keep it to that standard. I could have something done in a week. But to ensure it's good, it will take longer to test. The explanation came without his request in several follow-up messages. Izuku nodded to himself, but his decision was made. He took a deep breath. I'll give you enough to get one, but I want the new design to go into a helmet. What? He wasn't sure what she was asking. You'll give me enough to get one? Yes. What? Izuku looked at the repeated message. This is an investment. If you give me that much, I have to give you something in return. I can't take that. What do you suggest? Izuku sent back. I'll send you my very best babies. You can have them all. He wasn't sure what to think about that. He didn't think he'd be able to fit the number she implied in his room, and he didn't want Tomura to dust them. How about one for the moment? Your best one? I'll give it back when you finish. Like a hostage? More like a bond, Izuku replied. You have a deal. There wasn't any hesitation in the reply. I'll make you the smallest, most powerful respirator on the planet. With a long battery life and self-cleaning scrubbers. He didn't know what the last was, but figured it was something needed. He taped through and transferred her the money. Send the funds. Where do I send my baby? Izuku gave her the address of Kurogiri's bar. Are you sure you don't want something else? I've got some good ones. A baby to booby-trap your door? A baby to massage your back? A baby to hold your homework? Izuku smiled at the suggestions before he thought about something. Do you have anything that mimics sunlight? No, but I can make something. Can you make it small and wearable, so that the light is released onto skin? If he could get something like that to wear, then he could keep himself full of energy even in the dark. You like your wearable tech? Yes, I can do that. Then how about you make that, as well, and we'll call it even. First, Izuku sort of knew what she wanted to say. I really want that respirator for my dad, and you are the only one I can trust to make it. It will be the best you've ever seen. Thank you. No, first, thank you. No one else has believed I can build things. But, you made the finder. You are the first person who's ever bought anything. And the only person. Izuku looked at the message. He wasn't sure what to feel about that. I won't be the last, he sent her. I know I won't be the last, he reinforced the message. But you'll always be first. End the Emperor's Dragon, Fledgling, Chapters 7 and 8. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.